Lesson number 6. I can hardly believe it. Lesson number 6. And this is Mindfulness of Feelings, Part 2. And I'd like to actually begin today's session with a practice that is connected to something that I mentioned in our session last time. If you remember, last time I made reference to the work of the psychotherapist who was very, very interested in the universality of emotion and feelings, and traveled the world and found that indeed there are what he called or deemed the 5 core emotions, so that I can be anywhere on the planet and we do not have to speak the same language, but I would be able to recognize in another person, and he or she would be able to recognize in me one of these 5 or all of these 5 core emotions. And if you remember, they are anger, fear, disgust, surprise, and happiness. So what's interesting about his work, and I may or may not have mentioned this last week, is that he went on to really hone in his research into the way in which feelings get expressed in our facial expression and what he identified as microfacial expressions. And we are not even aware of our capacity to read facial expression and micro expressions, but we can do it. And it's one of the ways in which we can identify both within other people and even within ourselves how we're feeling, even if we're not consciously aware that that's what we're doing. So I bring this up because our face faces the world, and our face and our facial musculature, and even some of the, like, for example, the joint that's in the jaw, our facial musculature is part of the way in which we express emotion, but it's also part of the way that we hold emotion. So you may have had the experience of perhaps meeting someone that you've not seen in a long time, and you know that they've been through a lot, and you can see it on their faces. You can see the way in which the emotion has been etched into the facial musculature. And so our faces are very, very tied to feeling and emotional expression. So how does that relate to mindfulness? Well, we can start to become aware of the way that we use our own faces when we're expressing our feelings, when we're expressing emotionally. But we can also work to calm or to bring the facial muscles into a state of neutrality. And it's really surprising what happens when you bring your awareness to the face and what's happening in the face. You sort of relax through all of that, and you begin to notice some changes in your mindset, in your mood, and most of all, you begin to notice this sort of quieting of the mental chatter or the mental machinations of the mind. So I want to lead you through a really, really quick practice, and you can continue to do this practice for as long as you'd like if you want to implement it into your own life or throughout the day. And I would like you to do this throughout the day, maybe 2 or 3 times between now and the next time I see you, to shift into this practice really quickly. Move yourself through it and just notice the way in which a relaxed, neutral face has an impact on the way you think, on how you're feeling, and even in the way in which you choose to respond to situations that might be really triggering or difficult. All right? So to begin, I want you to find that comfortable and supportive seat. And by now, you know what works for you, okay? So I'm coming into this seat by bringing my feet about hip-width apart, feeling the sensation of these feet against the floor as a form of grounding and support. I want my spine to be tall, dignified, yet relaxed. Shoulders down and back, and palms resting comfortably on the thighs. So whatever it takes for you to come into that comfortable seat, please do. Eyes can be closed or open very slightly. It's up to you. We're just going to spend a few moments finding our seat and preparing for this practice. Maybe for a few moments, just noticing the quality of the breath, the quality of that inhalation, and the quality of that exhalation. And maybe with each exhalation, letting go of all thoughts, worries, and concerns of anything that happened prior to coming on to this session. And setting aside worries, concerns, thoughts about anything that might occur after our session. And I invite you to guide your awareness to your face and just become aware of your face and how your face feels. Perhaps allowing the forehead to soften. The temples and the muscles around your eyes softening and relaxing. Allow the jaw to relax. Allow the lips to come together very gently. Allow a slight separation between the upper and lower teeth inside of the mouth, so there's no clenching. And wherever the tongue is, just let it go limp inside of the mouth. And now, allow a very shy, slight smile to come across your lips. Very shy, slight smile. A smile that feels like contentment and just a general sense of ease and well-being. A shy, slight smile cues the brain that all is well. All is well. And when the lips, teeth, and tongue are in this position, Lips gently together, slight separation between the upper and lower teeth, tongue relaxed. When the lips, teeth, and tongue are in this position, the face comes into a state of neutral. Notice there's no contraction in any of the facial muscles. And so the face comes into rest. And you might notice that when the face is relaxed, the body follows. When the face is relaxed, the mind too might relax. Just taking a few moments to notice how the face feels now compared to when we began. To notice how you feel in that shy, slight smile. And with all the facial muscles in neutral. And then gently letting go of this practice. And just taking a few moments to sit in quiet. This face faces the world. And whenever you're ready, but only when you're ready, you can open your eyes. So this really simple adjustment, sometimes all it takes for me, if I'm on the verge of being really triggered emotionally, is to just take a moment of pause and to literally bring my lips, teeth, and tongue into the position I described. Lips together gently, separation between the upper and lower teeth so you're not clenching. And the tongue is actually a muscle. Relax it. Shy, slight smile across the lips, cueing the brain. All's going to be well. Sometimes that's all that it takes for me to shift from a potentially highly reactive state into one that is more responsive. And that's really what our session is about today. Because last time we talked about the foundation of mindfulness of feelings being about awareness. We've got to start with awareness. So once we begin to cultivate an awareness of what we're feeling, step 2 is really about how are we going to meet what we're feeling? Or more commonly, how are we going to manage what we're feeling in a way that is mindful and in a way that is aligned with our best selves showing up and navigating through a really complicated social world. So before we launch into that content, I just sort of want to revisit a couple of points from last time. The key point being that protocol that I outlined for you for cultivating awareness of feelings, right? And part of the way that I led you through that was through a guided meditation. If you remember, I asked for you to bring to mind the sensation of a feeling that is something that you've been grappling with, a feeling that has been troubling for you or difficult or challenging for you. And the first thing we did was we named it, right? We allow it to arise. We become very aware. It's here. Anger is here. Fear is here, whatever it is, right? We label it as such because if I can name it, I can tame it. If I can name it, then I can start developing a plan for how I'm going to respond to it. Step 3 is locating it in the body. Where am I feeling this right now in my body? And we started today with the face. And I want you to sort of become really mindful and aware of what your face feels like when you're experiencing joy, what your face does when you're experiencing anger or disappointment or disgust or sadness. All of those core emotions that Paul Ekman discovered, that there's a universality of those emotions and that we recognize them across the planet in terms of how they're being expressed through the face. So locating in your body, so you might start noticing, yeah, I feel anger tends to show up for me in my gastrointestinal tract, here in the chest and the heart, maybe in the throat, maybe in the head, but also in my face in certain ways. So we're aware of what's arising, we name it, we locate it in the body, then we investigate it with kindness. And if you remember last time, the way we investigated it was, if this feeling had a color, what would it be? If it had a shape, if it had a texture, if it had a sound, if it had a size. So that investigation, that curiosity about whatever the feeling is, gives us a little bit of space from it. So we're not it. We don't become the anger, but rather we get a little bit of space from it. And at the same time, if I start to get curious about it, I'm also creating spaciousness for it to be here with me. Always remembering, right? Always remembering. One of the truths about our feelings is that they're never permanent. They're always changing. There's always fleeting. And I used the analogy last time of the visitor, feelings as visitors. Visitors who come to visit us never intend to stay, and we never expect that they're going to stay. Well, the same is true of our feelings. They come and then they go. So there's an impermanence there. So I can create a spaciousness for anger to be here, because as soon as I start to create resistance to it, then I start to get triggered. Then I start to experience forms of suffering, right? So locating it in the body, investigating it, but investigating it with a whole lot of kindness. And I spoke with you last time about how hard we tend to be on ourselves related to the kinds of things we're feeling. And wow, if you could just work for a week or two with befriending whatever it is that comes up. And trust me, this is a challenge for me ongoingly, to really take a kind and tender and friendly approach to whatever's coming up, whatever it is, and to really, really refrain from, as often as possible, not getting caught up in that part of me that can be very judgmental, that can feel really let down or disappointed in myself because of what I'm feeling. So that kind of self-compassion is really important. And we'll talk a little bit more about that toward the end of our session today. And then finally, we looked at that notion of message, remembering that feelings really are messengers of sorts. And usually when they arise, especially when we feel that they're arising on a fairly regular basis, they often have things to tell us, things that perhaps we need to look at, things that perhaps we might need to work on, or to address, and sometimes things that we need to take action on. So, but again, with a great deal of curiosity, like this anger that is visiting right now, this anger that is present, what is it here to tell me? And if you remember last time, the example I gave is that more often than not, under anger are those three things. That sense of feeling really afraid, that sense of feeling very hurt, and that sense of feeling very helpless. That's an example of taking a feeling like anger and investigating it, like getting down underneath it. What is underneath this? All right, so those are the key points that I wanted to highlight based on last week's session, okay? Remember that protocol that we followed when we are working with feelings mindfully, noticing them as they arise, so cultivating that awareness, naming, if I can name it, I can deal with it, right? I can meet it in the way that I want to meet it, locating it in the body, doing some investigation with a lot of curiosity. You see, there's a lightheartedness that's associated with being curious about anything. So investigating with curiosity, contemplating, is there a message here? Being really kind with yourself and non-judgmental about what's arising. And then the most pivotal and important question is, can I just be with this? Can I be with what is here now? Can I allow or create the spaciousness to hold this, whatever it is? Okay, so those are the key points from session 5. So I continue after many, many, many years of daily meditation. I continue to work through feelings and emotions mindfully, and I'm always in this process of discovery. So that awareness in me is always evolving. It's always evolving. That's why we call it a practice. We are practicing. I am still practicing, and I will continue to still practice. This isn't anything that I will ever master. So I'm always surprised and intrigued by the things that I learn when I continue to bring mindfulness to my feelings. So that awareness continues to grow in me, just as like it will continue to grow in you. But the next question is, okay, now that I'm aware and my awareness continues to evolve, what do I then do with what I'm noticing? What do I do with what's coming up? And this is where we get into the meeting of these feeling states, the meeting of emotion. Now, oftentimes we use the word manage when we talk about how we deal with emotion or feelings, especially when they're difficult. And I want to make a distinction here, and I want to remind you of the power of words, because there's a real difference. There's a different tone to the word manage versus to meet. So I was doing a little bit of writing on this morning, and to manage means to kind of grapple with something, to perhaps begin to try to control or manipulate it, versus, and just notice the difference. So I might manage my feelings or attempt to manage my emotional states, or I might meet them. And when I show up to meet someone or something, I am coming closer to it. I am leaning into it. I am moving toward it, regardless of what it is. So there's the management of anger. There's the management of my fear, which feels like a grappling, sort of feels like work. And then there is the meeting. The anger is here. The fear is here. The frustration is here. So Christine, how are you going to meet it? How are you going to lean into it? How are you going to come close to it? And then the question becomes for me, Christine, how will you meet difficult feelings? Who will you be as you're meeting difficult feelings or emotional states? So that's what our lesson is about today, the meeting of difficult feelings as opposed to the management. I just want you to think about how working with language and the power of language can sort of conjure different things, not only in our minds, but even in our bodies. You know, management feels like, again, grappling, taking control of, reining in, manipulating, whereas meeting, there's something that's far lighter and open and very courageous and sort of vulnerable about the notion of meeting our feelings. So one of the most important questions that we can ask when we're meeting difficult feelings is, do I want to be reactive or do I want to be responsive in this moment of meeting this difficult feeling, this difficult person, this difficult situation? And again, I want you to think about reactivity versus being responsive. Reactivity is our default. As human beings, we are primed and we are ready to go from birth to react when necessary. And you'll notice that there are certain things that trigger all of us. And our triggers are really different. And when I think about reactivity and moments in my life when I'm reactive, this is how it feels. There's a situation or there is a person who has pushed my buttons in such a way that I just, without thought, without taking a pause, without contemplating or choosing a response, I just react. And in moments of high reactivity, we often find that they can be really explosive. They rarely, if ever, lead to anything positive in terms of how we feel internally. They very rarely lead to anything positive between two people, relationally speaking. And almost always after being reactive in reference to a person or a situation, we feel a lot of regret. We feel disappointed in ourselves. We might feel guilt or shame. It's those moments when afterwards, whether it's 5 minutes afterwards or 2 hours afterwards, we think to ourselves, wow, I really handled that really poorly, or I wish that that didn't happen, or I wish that I had taken a moment to have offered a different kind of response, a different kind of I wish that I had dealt with it really differently. So whenever there's regret, feeling ashamed, feeling guilty, just feeling really badly, you know, like, wow, the better version of me, I don't know where she was in that particular moment. That's reactivity. So reactivity feels really heated. And it feels, when we are reactive, that we just don't have any control whatsoever. And in this moment, or in these moments, it's as if we are emotionally hijacked. And it is our feelings, our emotional states that have taken over and are running the show. So that's reactivity. And we don't feel very free when we are highly reactive. In fact, many people, when they contemplate or reflect upon reactivity, will say, I feel enslaved by my emotions. I feel held captive by my emotions. I feel like they yank me around, like I don't have any sort of control over them. That's reactivity. We see reactivity in really young children who something happens, something triggers them, and immediately there's a tantrum. Immediately there's a crying fit. Immediately there's anger that comes up. as we grow and evolve, we start to develop a sense of how to meet difficult people and situations and difficult feelings in ways that are more appropriate. But we could all use some work in strengthening our capacity to be more responsive. So here's the difference between the reactivity and being responsive. When I am responsive, I am very aware that I have a choice, that I have a choice. I am very aware that between anything that's triggering me and what I do and what I say, I get to take a pause. There's actually a space between myself being triggered and whatever it is that I decide to do in response. Response being key here, and choice being key here, and freedom being key here. This is how responsivity is how I disentangle myself from the heated nature of feeling states. I disentangle myself from the potential of becoming reactive. Now, this doesn't mean that I don't have my moments, because I certainly do. This is something I work on every day in some capacity, because as I mentioned to you, as human beings, we are hardwired to be reactive. It's the way in which we keep ourselves safe. So know your triggers, and part of the way that you can start to get familiar with your triggers is to think to yourself, what makes me feel threatened? Typically speaking, generally speaking, when I feel threatened, it's because there's some aspect of my identity that's being threatened, some aspect of my role in the world, my title. Whenever I feel like my beliefs, values, and attitudes are being threatened, anything that I hold dear, when I feel it's being threatened, there's a high possibility that I'm going to be reactive. Any sort of previous trauma can trigger reactivity. So spending some time thinking upon your own life and your own experience and asking, wow, when do I get really fired up? What triggers, what words, what ideas, when triggered, make me forget that I have a choice. I always have a choice to be responsive over reactive. So some training in tools and strategies that can help us to become more mindful of a responsive state and to approach difficulties mindfully, responsively, is appropriate here when we're dealing with mindfulness of feelings. I'll never forget that one of my very first coaching clients was a man who was going through a really, really difficult divorce, like a lot of triggers. And when I heard sort of the backstory of this situation, I thought, yeah, I can see how this is going to be very, very difficult. If he doesn't make some changes in how he's sort of meeting all of the feelings that are coming up. And I knew that he and I would work very well together because he said to me, Christine, my goal in working with you is that I want to be the best version of myself as I navigate this really complicated divorce. I want to be the best version of me possible. Can you help me to do that? I want to be the best version of myself, not just for me. I want to be the best version of myself as I navigate this, because I want to be a really great role model for my kids. I want to show them that it is possible to navigate something really difficult like this with a lot of integrity and authenticity and honesty and responsivity. And I knew that that would be our work together. Our work together was really about how to keep him in a responsive as opposed to a reactive state. So he did not want to be enslaved or feeling as if he was being held captive by the feelings that were arising in reference to what was happening in that divorce. One of my favorite quotes about being responsive comes from the work of Viktor Frankl. And many of you might be familiar with his book because it is a very, very prominent book in our history. And the book is titled Man's Search for Meaning. Now, Viktor Frankl was an Austrian psychotherapist and neurologist who studied both the brain and depression. He was a Holocaust survivor. And when he was taken to camp along with his parents and his family and his children and his wife and held captive, he lost every member of his family. And he was kept alive primarily because they used him for insight into the workings of the human brain and his insights into psychology. So his contribution to us as human beings is a really important lesson in how you remain responsive in a situation where you have every right to be highly triggered. He was tortured, he was held captive, he endured tremendous grief and loss, and yet made a choice that he was going to be responsive. He was not going to be enslaved by his grief, by his anger, by his rage. So there is a quote that he's quite famous for, and some of you might be familiar with it, but in this context, it's really important. And the quote is this: between stimulus and response, there is a space. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space resides our ability to choose our response. And therein lies our freedom. So between being triggered and whatever it is that I decide to do, there is a space, there is a pause, and you need to claim your place in that space. You need to claim your right to that pause, because in that space of that pause, you get to choose how you're going to respond to the fact that you've just been triggered. And therein lies your freedom. And he knew that. He knew that in every moment of torture, that in every moment of being mistreated by his captors, that he could either be highly reactive or he could be responsive. And that's how he felt his freedom, even in his captivity. There is one thing that you cannot take from me. There is one thing that no one can take from us, and that is our ability to choose our response. So know your triggers. Begin to get familiar with what triggers you and claim for yourself today. Claim for yourself that from this day forward, I'm claiming my place in that space. I'm claiming my right to take the pause so that I can choose how I'm going to respond to this matter, to this issue, to whatever it is that I'm feeling. So how do we do that? Most of us would agree, I'm signing up for that. That sounds great. I recognize that the moments in my life where I made a decision to pause rather than to go ballistic, you can think about reactivity in terms of like a nuclear reactor. All you need to do to generate a nuclear reactor is push a button. There's no pause between pushing the button and having that thing explode. There's no pause. And that's how we can be in reactivity. It's actually a really good analogy. But I want to claim that space. I want to claim that pause because I want to be free. I don't want to be enslaved, overwhelmed by, held captive by my feelings. And more importantly, I want to operate in my life. I want to show up in my relationships as someone who is responsive as opposed to reactive. That is a gift that you give other people. That is a gift that you bestow upon relationships that matter to you. Your choice to be responsive is a gift, and it's a gift you give to yourself because it keeps you free and it keeps you at peace. Does not mean it's easy. Okay, so here are some tools. All right, what I call the 3 R's, or what are known as 3 R's. You're about to get triggered, or you are triggered. And you've decided based on today's lesson, I'm claiming the space, I'm claiming the pause. The 3 R's, number 1, are you're going to rest. You retreat. All right, you've just been triggered. You're going to retreat by stepping back, creating some distance between yourself and the trigger. You're going to regroup. That's where you come into the space of the pause. Retreat, regroup, and then respond. And you take as long as you want and as long as you need in that regrouping. But the first step here is becoming aware of the fact I am triggered. So I'm going to take a moment, or I'm going to take an hour, or I'm going to take a day, or for however long you need, and really being honest and transparent with people in your life. Hey, I'm feeling really triggered right now. So I'm going to retreat. I'm going to take some time to regroup. And then I'm going to come back and I'm going to actually respond. I'm not going to react. Do you see the kind of awareness that this requires, which you're cultivating in these practices? The permission that you give yourself is in that space. And then you get to decide when you come back in the response how it is that you're going to deal with it. So the 3 R's: retreat, regroup, respond. Another thing that you can do is you can reconnect to one of your anchors. Perhaps you've been using the anchor of your breath in your formal practice. Perhaps you've been using the anchor of your body in your formal practice. There have been times in my life, really, really difficult times, where I had the potential to be reactive almost all the time, where I relied on the soles of my feet. I relied on the sensation of the soles of my feet on the floor to keep me in a responsive state. There are times now when I will instinctively, intuitively take my hands and bring them right here to my heart. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter where I am. But if I'm feeling triggered, the mere act of bringing my hands and placing them over my heart is a reminder. Christine, come back to the space. Come back to the pause by coming back to yourself. Protect your freedom. Right? Therein lies your freedom, in your capacity to choose your response. Perhaps your anchor is a mantra, a word or a phrase that brings you back into the pause or the space. At a stage and phase in my own divorce journey, where again, highly reactive on both sides, I developed a mantra for myself so that whenever I was in a difficult situation, a difficult conversation with my husband, where reactivity was very, very highly probable, I adopted a strategy where I said these words, and they may not work for you, they worked for me. They really worked for me. And the phrase was, love and light, love and light. In all matters and all things, I wish you love and light. And I just sort of heard them. I chanted them in my mind in these really potentially heated moments, right? Standing face to face, eye to eye with my husband. And chanting that love and light, in all matters and all things, I wish you love and light. And I meant it, even though we're going through this really difficult time right now, even though this feels really terrible, even though there's a lot of conflict here, even though I want to defend myself against you and you're defending yourself against me, for me to have that running in the background kept me responsive. Calm and ease and responsiveness is contagious. He didn't need to know that that's what was going through my mind in those moments, but I will tell you that the fact that I was able to keep myself together, to claim that space of pausing before I responded, diffused almost every situation that we were in where we were potentially getting to that highly reactive, going ballistic state. So are there certain words? Maybe the word is just peace, peace, peace. I wish you well, I wish you well, I wish you well. Whatever it is there a word? Ease, 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 calm, that you can choose, that you can just have really handy. When you start to feel triggered, the awareness, it begins with the awareness. And then you move into that notion that, whoa, I have a choice here. Okay? So a final question or inquiry that you can do, this is another tool that you can utilize to stay responsive, is to ask yourself this question. And this has been a game-changing question for me. And the question is, Christine, how are you going to meet this moment? This moment before you, which has the potential to have you go reactive, or this person you're with go reactive, or the both of you go reactive. How are you going to meet this moment? Not manage, but how are you going to meet it? How are you going to step into it? What are you going to bring to it? How are you going to come close to it? How are you going to lean into it as opposed to resisting it or running away from it or fighting it? How are you going to meet this moment? And the more important question for me has been, what version of yourself do you want to show up right now? So there are 4 things that I decided about 2 years ago that were really important elements, and they've really become a North Star of sorts for me in terms of how I want to show up in all of my relationships and how I want to show up, especially in difficult times. And those 3 things are open. I want to be open. I don't want to be closed and defended. This is closed down and defended. I want to remain open. I want to remain very committed to staying curious, because curiosity for me gives me that space that I need. And that space grants that ability to be responsive. So I want to be curious. My friend Jay taught me a lot about curiosity when he was working a few years ago in a real hostile work environment. And he said one of the mindfulness strategies that he employed that worked very powerfully for him was, in the face of a colleague or someone he was training, right in his face, furious, angry, disgusted, just, really spewing forth a lot of negativity. Jay said, I decided, rather than becoming reactive and defensive and meeting that furious tone with a furious tone, rather than meeting anger with anger, I decided to move from being furious to curious. As soon as I felt the sensation of becoming furious, I moved into curiosity. I never forgot that, from furious to curious. And he said everything shifted. So I can have the angriest person coming at me, but rather than meeting that with an equal level of being furious or angry, I sort of shifted into, this is kind of interesting. I wonder, what is behind all of this anger? What is triggering this? What is this really about? And when he could maintain that spirit of curiosity, again, this other person didn't need to know what was going on within him, but it started to diffuse that situation. All right, so start thinking about ways in which you can meet the moment. So for me, staying open, staying curious, staying committed to our connection. And now that's not always possible, but as often as possible, I want to do whatever I can, even if it's difficult, even if there's conflict here, to staying committed to maintaining our connection. And then finally, staying committed to growth and learning. I want to learn through all these experiences. What is the point of moving through them if I don't learn something? So those four things are my North Star. So when I'm coming into a potentially difficult situation with feelings, emotions, a situation, dealing with a person, I'm always asking myself, okay, what do you need to do to stay open? Are you maintaining that spirit of curiosity? Are you doing what you can to maintain this connection and staying boundaried? And are you remaining open to growth and learning? And when I can stay motivated by those four things, when they are part of my intention in dealing with difficulties and my relationships in my life, I am able to stay responsive. So our mindfulness practices, when practiced with some commitment and devotion, will heighten our capacity for our awareness. What is arising? How am I going to meet what is arising? And how can I choose as often as possible to be responsive to what is arising, as opposed to being reactive? So part of the promise of these practices is getting to responsivity on a more regular basis. And you will experience such a freedom in that. And you will experience such an expansion and a deepening in your relationships with coworkers, relationships in your personal life, even relationships with strangers. We began our session today by working with the face. And if you remember, part of that meditation was bringing the lips into that shy, slight smile. If you experiment with that as you're out and about in the world, whether you're getting your coffee at Starbucks or you're walking around Wegmans and you meet the eyes of another person, if you just sort of gaze at them with those eyes and with that shy, slight smile, which is just peace and contentment. And it's an openness and it's a responsiveness, being responsive to human connection. You will really see that person standing before you, a shift, even in them. So start to notice how your practice, your formal practice, your mini practices throughout the day, just start to notice how those are starting, the benefits of those things are starting to spill over into all areas of your life. So there's one thing that I want to leave you with before we bring this session to a close. And I want to sort of plant the seed for this so that you can think about it between now and the next time when we come together for Mindfulness of Feelings Part 3. And this idea, which is linked to both mindfulness, awareness, and responsiveness, has everything to do with story. When something happens, one of the things that we tend to do, especially if it's something that triggers us, is we almost immediately go into creating a story about what's going on. And these stories may or may not be true, but again, it's just something that we do. We are human beings, and we are also what is called homo narratus. We are human storytellers. Our capacity for story is born inside of us. It's a key way in which we learn, and it's the way in which we navigate through the world. It's the way in which we allow others to know us, and we get to know others. But I want you to start thinking about things that happen and the story you're telling yourself about things that happen and the degree to which that story shapes whether or not you're going to be reactive or responsive, but most of all, the way that your story can shape suffering. So your colleague, it's the start of a day, and your colleague breezes into the office, and you notice that he or she just sort of walks very quickly right past your desk, doesn't acknowledge you, doesn't say hello. And in what little you've seen of his or her facial expression, you've decided that it was disgust, negativity, and so the story making begins. So you begin telling a story to yourself about what all of that means, why he or she did not acknowledge you, what the facial expression was all about, and you've decided that he or she must be really angry with you based on something you said at a meeting the day before. This is just an example. Well, I promise you, if you start that narrative, it's going to continue to evolve, and then the next time you see your colleague that day, that story you've been telling is going to impact how you show up in that interaction. So, a beautiful practice when you find yourself weaving narratives about something that has happened, a beautiful practice is to stop yourself and say, what story am I telling myself here? And how is it contributing to my feeling reactive, my feeling badly, my feeling judgmental, whatever it is? There was this really interesting article that was published in the New York Times a few years ago. And it was about those bubbles that appear when we've texted something and we're waiting for a response. And it was an article about anxiety and how growing numbers of people are developing anxiety about the text bubbles. So the example they give is in a couple relationship. One member of the couple texts, "So what about us?" And he or she is watching the response and starts seeing the bubbles and the bubbles and the bubbles, indicating that the recipient is responding. And it's taking a really long time. So you start crafting a story. Oh boy, this is going to be a really long response. And this could be really good news or really bad news, right? And that anxiety starts mounting, but the anxiety starts mounting because of the way that we are interpreting what the bubbles mean. And then worse, all of a sudden the bubbles just stop, and an hour goes by and there's no response, and 2 hours go by and there's no response. And maybe in the earlier example, your colleague was stuck in traffic and has the symptoms of the flu. So breezing by your desk and not acknowledging you has nothing to do with you, but now you've suffered about it. And maybe those bubbles has nothing to do with you. Maybe there was some sort of emergency on the other side for the recipient. Maybe the recipient had something come up. Maybe the recipient decided, I really need to give this some thought. I just don't know. We don't know. So a good practice might be to go to the colleague and say, hey, the story I'm telling myself about how you came in this morning is that you're really upset with me because of what I said yesterday in the meeting. Or the story I'm telling myself about the fact that I made myself really vulnerable and texted you a message and watched those bubbles and you didn't get back to me is this. I want to check out my perception with you. I want to check out the story. What's going on? That is a mindful approach to our communication, to our relationship. It is a responsive approach as opposed to a reactive approach. So I thought that article was really interesting because this is a really common phenomenon. We put something out there and we see those bubbles. What do we make the bubbles mean? What story do we tell ourselves about the bubbles? And how does that impact how we feel, what we think, and what we're potentially going to say, and whether or not we're going to react or we're going to respond? So lots to think about today. I realize we're at the 2 p.m. mark, so I'm going to close. I want to invite you over the course of the next 2 weeks to continue to work with mindfulness of feelings in your formal practice, perhaps just noticing feelings as they arise and pass. As you remember last time, I name anger, fear, joy, whatever it is, or move through that protocol. What is arising? Name it. Investigate it with curiosity, right? Does it have a message? Can I be with it? Can I be kind in reference to it? In the supportive email for this lesson, there is a guided meditation on empathy, and that's where we're going to start next time. We're going to start with what is empathy? What is it and what is it not? Why is it important? How does empathy, or how do empathy and mindfulness connect? They're very, very important to each other. And how do our mindfulness practices increase pretty significantly our capacity to be empathetic? So self-awareness. Today we talked about meeting difficult emotion and feelings and all kinds of strategies for doing that, with this real focus on becoming more responsive, taking that time, that pause, claiming that space for yourself so that you're free and that you get to choose how you're going to respond. And then finally ending with this idea about storying. And I want you to think about that and just sort of be very, very aware when something happens and you feel triggered. What story are you creating about it? And what happens when you don't check that story out? And do not be afraid to use the tool. Hey, the story I'm telling myself about such and such is, and I want to check that out with you. So that's quite a bit for today. I'm going to hang out in this call for the next 10 minutes or so. If any of you want to stay, if you have questions, if there are anyone who's joined the call who has a B, who hasn't acknowledged that, please do at this time, because right now Amanda's the only one who came forth with the B. And if she's the only one, she will be the winner here of this session. Okay. You can feel free if you want to unmute yourself if you have a question. Hey, Amanda.
Hi. Great.
All
It was a great lesson today. Thank you. It was nice to listen to it on the beach too. So thank you.
Oh, Joan has a B. Okay. Let's see here. Anybody else? Let's see. Anybody else have a B? Anybody have any questions? All right, let's see here.
Why am I in safe driving mode? How do I get out of this?
Joan now has one. Joan, you have one. I had to choose that out of a little glass jar here. So I'll report that to Paige. Amanda, are you still there?
Yes, I'm here.
So bring that B to next session, okay?
Yeah, will do. I'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Okay, you take care.
All right, thanks.
You can hear everything?
Hi, Jasmine. If Jasmine, can you hear me? Give me a thumbs up. Or yes, I can hear you. Okay, Jasmine, what I'm going to do, since I already chose the names, is I'll put you in for next time. Okay? I'm going to put you in for our next lesson. Okay?
Oh, there's the Popeyes.
Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and close out the meeting. Thank you for coming today. Thank you for continuing to engage these practices. Wow, we have 2 sessions left. So I will see you next time, session 7, mindfulness of feelings, number 3, session 3, part 3. So until then, have a great 2 weeks and take good care.